if you watch pretty much any action movie, you will find out that there are two main characters in it. There is the good one and the bad or evil one. And those two are in constant conflict. The evil one is abusive, violent. He or she is willing to step on others in order to achieve anything that they want. Whereas the good character is kind and compassionate and wants to restore peace and justice by fighting and winning over the evil character. Now, those movies usually don't show us the background of the evil person. They depict that person as being inherently evil. A person who is like that, was like that, and will always be like that. We don't know their story. We don't know where they're coming from. We don't know what they have gone through during their lives. So we tend to assume that they were born evil, and therefore that they are irredeemably evil, that they can never change. And how can you deal with someone who is irredeemably evil? Well, either by somehow containing them, perhaps placing them behind bars, imprisoning them so they cannot have contact with us and our fellow humans, or by fighting against them, by destroying them. Is that not how collectively we are trying to deal with so-called evil people? We see criminals as bad, people who commit violence, people who commit pretty much any crime. We're like, these are bad people. We need to lock them up. We don't take a moment to understand where so-called evil behavior comes from. Where does violence come from? Where does the war mentality that some people have come from? Why are some people abusive? If we look into the issue, and a lot of psychologists have done that, there have been a lot of studies on that matter. And what they have found is that people who are abusive, people who are violent, are nearly always people who themselves have been abused, people who themselves have been victims of violence, people who have lived in traumatic circumstances, people who went through so much pain that they had to numb themselves to the pain of the world. They had to numb themselves to the people around them. They became desensitized. That's why you see that abusive and violent people are not so empathetic. If you feel empathy towards another person, how can you harm them? When we feel empathy, we see others as an extension of ourselves. So harming someone else feels like harming our very selves. And so by locking those people up, by trying to hurt them, by trying to punish them for their wrongdoings, we don't help them to become less violent. We actually make them even more violent. Because as we saw, hurt people hurt people. And if we continue hurting them, then they are going to become even more violent. That's why a lot of people who are thrown in jail, they usually become even more violent and more mentally disturbed. So if we don't understand the psychology behind abusive people. We cannot effectively deal with them. We create more pain. We perpetuate violence and suffering in society because we try to deal with the symptoms. You see that bad behavior of somebody. You're like, this person is bad. He must be the cause of the suffering that exists in society. But what if that person was not born violent, but became during his lifetime because of the conditions that he was living in? Then it is not about punishing that person, but about changing the conditions that cause people to become violent. But to do that, we need to feel empathy towards those people. We need to think, what if I were in their shoes? What if that person was me? And we could examine their history and understand where they're coming from. And see that if we were in their circumstance, we would most probably have acted how they did or how they do. That we're not so different than them, but we like to think that we are good people, that we would never harm anyone, even if we were placed in the worst circumstances. We would not have acted like them. So we dehumanize those people by this way of thinking. Now, to avoid misunderstanding, I don't mean to justify their behavior. Those people should be held accountable. And yes, there are times when we need to fight against them, but out of self-defense, not in order to hurt them, not in order to punish them, not in order to destroy them. Because we realize that this is not going to work. This is not going to restore justice or peace. It's going to do the exact opposite of what we are seeking to see. Instead, we will try to do our best to extend our compassion to them, to help them. And this is where what is called restorative justice comes in. So far, we have justice that seeks punishment. But restorative justice is about helping those people who commit crimes, who commit wrongdoings, so-called evil, to understand what they did, to take responsibility for their actions, to empathize with their victims. And this way they can go through a process of healing that eventually might help them transform their mind and transform their behavior, to help them become more kind and compassionate and generous. And there have been so many examples of that. Restorative justice does work. So to me, this is the only way to deal with violence, to deal with people who do so-called evil, by empathizing with them, understanding the conditions that led them to be who they are, and build systems that cultivate the positive aspects of ourselves, that cultivate our kindness, compassion, love, altruism, and not systems that reinforce and perpetuate the violence and the war mentality that is prevalent pretty much everywhere in the world.